ladies and gentlemen, here we are. 8 years, £50 and 105 gigabytes later, gamers have now experienced Rockstar Games' latest open world adventure, Red Dead Redemption 2. But is it a worthy follow-up to its really great predecessor? Well, here's my review. I only got around to playing the first Red Dead Redemption a couple of months ago, so I wasn't caught up in the hype surrounding its sequel like millions of other people. That means I went into the game knowing very little about it, but I did find myself excited to return to the quirky, exciting and beautiful worlds that was introduced in the original. But are all those elements still intact in the sequel? Well, I should really say prequel, because this game takes place 20 years before the first game's plot. That story followed John Marston hunting down members of his former group of outlaws, all of whom had been long since disbanded before the game begins. Redemption 2, on the other hand, shows the Van der Linde gang together in action. And while John is in the game, you'll be playing as new character Arthur Morgan. This story begins after a robbery goes wrong, forcing the gang into hiding. While the leader Dutch tries to work out their next move, the other members try to scrape together some extra money for the camp, and as Arthur, you'll find yourself thrown into all kinds of situations and adventures along the way. Now, while this sounds structurally similar to the last game, it's surprising how different the storytelling feels when you compare the two games. If the aspect ratio changing for cutscenes didn't make it obvious enough, there's a bit more of a cinematic kick this time around, and with a lot of less action-packed missions among other things, it's actually quite hard to compare these two games. Both have their own style, and as far as the story goes, they're both executed very well. As for this game, I really like the dynamic of travelling across the Wild West with this gang of outlaws, and the characters are very memorable. You'll more often than not partake in a mission with a small group of them, adding a sense of camaraderie with dialogue that is just as engaging as it was before. But what about our new lead, Arthur Morgan? Well, I do like him, but I prefer John Marston, primarily for their relationship with the world and the player. Allow me to explain. These two games give you the freedom to play as either an outright criminal or a bit of an anti-hero, only killing the necessary targets. In the first game, John is written in such a way that he can work as both depending on your playstyle. As for the sequel, this idea of a moral system is a bit more obvious, in that there is actually a moral system. It's not a big part of the experience, but you can choose how to interact with NPCs. Now, me being me, I always like to play nice in games like this, so I always greet fellow travellers on top of sparing potential victims. But in the story, Arthur can sometimes come across as aggressive and harsh, creating a small disconnect with player Arthur and the character Arthur that can be jarring. But aside from that, he's mostly a likeable and interesting presence to control through all the adventures he gets caught up in, and it also helps that those are very interesting adventures too. From exciting train robberies, stealthily playing Cupid for a Romeo and Juliet romance, hunting trips, a very strange day at the tavern, and more, there's a good variety of missions here that you'll experience with some really fun characters, and seeing some of them before the events of the first game is rather interesting as well.
Kid, while you still can.
Who are they?
Oh, no one in particular, Jack. He's only the guy you're going to... It is a very simple plot. After all, this is a Rockstar game, so it's really just an excuse for a myriad of interesting stories taking place in this Western-themed open world. But as per usual, it's done very well, and it helps shape the gameplay experience, which shakes up the formula established by the first game in some unexpected ways. But it does so by adding very little. The most notable new additions are the cores and having the gang's camp acting sort of like a hub, but they aren't that major in the grand scheme of things, particularly the latter. The former is somewhat important. Basically, things like stamina, deadeye, and health for both Arthur and your horse have to be restored by eating or drinking something, but it doesn't affect the rest of the experience massively. And while my description of the rest of the experience might sound very similar to the first game, you'll still be horse riding across a vast landscape, getting into gunfights and encountering numerous NPCs, it does feel very different. But that could be a good thing, breathing new life into this series so it doesn't feel like a rehash of the first, or it could ruin the experience. So does it? Well, let's take a look. Fitting in with the story's more cinematic vibe, most of the missions are notably slower paced than before, some of which are 65 to 70% walking or slowly riding towards the objective. Now this will be an issue for some people, but for me personally, it worked due to the banter between characters and mainly because these are some gorgeous locations you'll be exploring. There's no doubt about it, this is an insanely beautiful game. And because every chapter ends with the gang relocating to a new camp, oh yeah, this is the second sequel of 2018 to a game that didn't have chapters but now has them for some reason, the game keeps things aesthetically interesting throughout. And thanks to the return of not only matching the speed of your allies on horseback, but also following them by holding down X, I'd often find myself turning on the cinematic camera to take in the sights whilst heading towards the next task. And despite the occasional slower pace, you'll more often than not wind up in a gunfight of some description. Now I've seen several complaints geared towards the shooting mechanics in that they feel clunky and generally poor when compared to other shooters. Well, I don't know, maybe I haven't played enough shooters, but I found the gunplay to be good enough. The guns feel very satisfying to use, as well as some other weapons like knives and bows, and despite the lock-on and the return of Deadeye, the number of enemies still makes things overwhelming and challenging enough to keep things exciting. There's even a couple of small set pieces thrown in there too, and they're also good fun. But there's more to the action than firepower. You'll occasionally get thrown into some fistfights, which are a nice change of pace, even though it's not exactly challenging or that complex. There's also some minor stealth and the odd chase here and there where you can catch the chase E with a very fun to use whip. Yoink! There's a few other types of more mundane missions, and while I wouldn't say they're fun in the conventional sense, they're engaging within the game's world, and while they won't be to everyone's liking, I really enjoyed them. And that's something this game does incredibly well. I would never describe it as being extremely fun, because while it can be, it also does something many of the best games do. Create a compelling world that, even during its slowest moments, constantly excites. And Red Dead Redemption 2 has one of the most exciting open worlds I've ever visited. It's not because it's big, and yes, it is massive, but it doesn't feel like it. Each chapter takes place around a largish area that you become used to and learn more about as you traverse. This means that this world doesn't feel too overwhelming, and there's constantly a sense of life and personality to it that draws you into the atmosphere even more. Someone needs my help. Right, Arthur, it's time for you to put your messy past behind you and become the hero you were always destined to be! Never mind. Yes, the random encounters are back from the first game, but this time, some of these NPCs actually feel like people, and it adds another layer of immersion to the game. Take this scenario, for example, where you have a woman stuck under her exhausted horse. You can choose to take her back home, and if you do, she'll tell you about her life and Arthur will give her advice, which is such a small thing, but it really adds to the game. And along with side quests that feel like mini stories, it makes the world feel a lot more alive. And this is a very detailed world too. It's incredibly beautiful, but with some dark secrets. There's houses on mountains, factories, villages, camps, and gorgeous fields that feel riveting to explore. And because Arthur is a lot more customizable than John, and you can choose and name horses, there's plenty of instances where getting wanted feels like your own little misadventure, and that's a feeling I never got from the first game. This is going to sound incredibly weird, especially because this is a mature, violent game, but Red Dead Redemption 2 gives me a giddy feeling whenever I play it. It made me excited about its story, characters, and gameplay because of how enraptured I became with its quirky, beautiful world. This is the type of game that reminds me why I love video games. Yes, it has a great cinematic story, really enjoyable gameplay, and an environment filled with fun minigames and interactions, but it's how all of these elements come together to make for an experience that constantly thrills. This game isn't perfect. As I said, Arthur can clash a little with the player with his grumpy attitude, your horse's decreasing stamina can be a little too prevalent, and I understand that the slow cinematic pace might not be to everyone's tastes, but they're small inconveniences when compared to everything this game gets right. I'll score it 91%, but even so, I'm actually hesitant to call it better than the first game, as they're both really great and they approach Western open worlds differently, so they're not really comparable in that sense, but this one just struck a bigger chord with me. For the first time in a long while, a game captured my imagination and fully immersed me into a land of beauty, intrigue, charm, action and fun, and I loved it. The beta for Red Dead Online came out not too long ago, so seeing as it's still early doors for the mode, I'll give some brief thoughts for now. Why does my character look so ugly?